So today we're doing something new. Dick Sutliff, one of our members, has volunteered to discuss the loss of one of his friends and some of the conditions that he sees that maybe led to that loss. Again, I always invite our members, if you have a teachable experience and you would like to make a short presentation at one of our seminars, we welcome that, because I think firsthand discussions are really productive.
So can you stand and sit for a few more minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm probably the last lawyer to retire without a computer on his desk, so this is my technology. So the first thing I want to say is everything I say here today is the gospel truth, unless it's a violation of an FAR. And in that case, it is pure fiction. So this is back from my wife and I, our 41st year of flying. And she's a more experienced bush pilot because she soloed about 2 months before I did. But I got 5,000 hours of Alaska flying, and I wrecked her airplane 15 years ago, and I've bent 3 props. Last time I bent a prop, my mechanic said, "You know, a Tweety bird, it has a brain the size of a pea, and it always lands into the wind. What's the matter with you, Dick?" Well, I didn't have a good answer. I think I've made every mistake you can make flying and survive. And so maybe we can all think about that and not make some of those mistakes again. The reason I'm here is because a very good friend of mine killed himself last fall in eastern Washington. He attempted a no-go-around landing on a ridge, and after he got the wheels down, he decided to go around, firewalled it, and he hit a rock about the size of a pickup truck. It took the left gear off of his airplane. The rear gear leg bent the longeron jammed the aileron cable, and so he was in the air for a while before he crashed and was killed. And I think that accident didn't have to happen. And so I went home and I sat on my desk and I wrote out the list of my friends who have been killed or have killed themselves in airplane crashes, and there were 14 names on that list, and that was pretty sobering. And then I saw a video on the internet, and it's a video of a guy landing, and I don't know where it was, but it's an island in the middle of a river. The river comes down and splits and it goes around the island. Half of the island, the upstream half, is tall trees from edge to edge and from the middle up to the end. The lower half is a flat gravel bar. And his friend videos this, so he circles around and he comes in and he lands on that gravel bar. He puts his wheels down in the water, he rolls out, nothing happens, he turns around and takes off. Apparently no reason to be there except for the video. And I thought about that and I said, you know, all he had to have was a 5 or 10 knot unestablished tailwind, or if he'd have hit one of his wheels on a 6-inch rock in that river, he would have been into the trees. And you know, this thing seems to be becoming common, is to undertake these very difficult landing situations for the purpose of having a picture of your airplane in a crazy place, or for somebody to video you doing it. You know, Evel Knievel got paid for this sort of thing. So after that, I decided, that's when I asked Rocky if I could come in and talk to you guys. So that's not the culture that I was raised in flying. And an illustration of that is a friend of mine, 30 years ago, it was legal to hunt wolves from the air and land and shoot them. And so he was building up his skills and learning to do that. And there was another guy up there that was obviously landing and doing stuff that he couldn't do. So he got a hold of this guy and they went out and flew together. And And they looked at a lot of different places you could land, and after an hour or so of flying, my friend, he saw a place, I don't know, it was a ridge or a gravel bar, whatever, that he thought he could land on. So he passes over it, he turns, he pulls back the power, he puts the flaps on, and this old Alaska bush pilot in the back seat taps him on the shoulder and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I thought I would land." He said, "Never land unless you have a reason." And I think that's a good point. You know, have a reason. You know, I spent 40 years as an insurance defense lawyer. What that means is I represented people who got in accidents, and typically they injured somebody else or did property damage, but typically somebody else got injured or killed. So I represented people involving auto accidents and airplane accidents and marine accidents and construction accidents and all kinds of places where people screwed up. And I learned a couple of things from that over the years. One is, we are foreseeably fallible. We make mistakes. It's just beyond our capacity to not make mistakes. We can't be perfect. And the problem is we don't know when we're going to screw up. We don't get advance notice that on this landing we're going to screw it up. All I can tell you is it's going to happen. So, you know, the rules of the road are really helpful. In my business, if drivers stopped at stop signs and red lights, obeyed the speed limit, and didn't drink and drive, I'd have been out of business. But I had those kind of cases in my office all the time. You know, the FARs provide some reasonable, useful barriers. A lot of those regulations came out of the kinds of accidents that I used to have to handle. You know, you can get some thought about think about the Valdez short field landing competition. Those guys strip their airplanes down to their underpants, and they practice over and over and over and over again. But if you sit on the sidelines and watch them, they can't do it every time. They land short, they land long, it just doesn't work out perfectly every single time. So why land in a place that requires perfection? I once read a book called Heavy Weather Sailing. And the title of the first chapter was "Don't Seek Storms." You know, Ernie Gann wrote a book called Fate is the Hunter. And Ernie Gann was an aviation pilot. Fate is the hunter. You know, why tempt fate? She's fickle. She can get us. You know, I wanted to, Rocky wouldn't let me do it, but Russian roulette is I don't know if people actually ever did it, but the idea of it is you take a revolver, you put one round in the cylinder, and you spin the cylinder, and you point it at your head and pull the trigger, and then you pass the gun to the other guy, and he does that. So what I wanted to do was bring in a revolver and sit here and turn it so you could hear it. Click, 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 click. And then say, okay, we've checked, cylinders are all empty. Which of you would point that revolver at your head and pull the trigger? I don't see any volunteers. How about if I bring Paige up here and she checks it out? And you know, she's an honest person. You willing to take that chance? I don't think so. Then the question is, you know, is it a 5-shot J-frame? Is it a 6-shot single action? Or is it a 9-shot? How many chambers are there? You gotta be sure that they're all empty. You know, a very well-known firearms instructor had a negligent discharge a year or so ago. A woman on the line was having trouble with her revolver, so she checked that it was unloaded, she handed it to the line officer, he checked that it was unloaded, he handed it to this expert, he checked that it was unloaded, he pulled the trigger, and bang! Turned out it was a stainless steel revolver with a chrome-plated cartridge in the chamber. Silver and silver. He didn't see it. That's the kind of mistakes that human beings make. Now, we can choose how many empty chambers we have and how many shells we put in those chambers with how we approach our flying. And mistakes are certain. So we have an opportunity to add shells and remove shells as we're undertaking our activities. So, you know, if the strip is rough, that's a shell in the chamber. We gotta take one out somewhere. Well, let's take out the one and make the rule that we're not gonna land crosswind in a rough strip, because if we do, it's gonna bounce, and the chances are it'll bounce right sideways and be off the runway. If the shortest strip, if the strip is short, we gotta have good approaches. We gotta have a good escape route. We gotta figure that out in advance. Suppose that there's no go-around, like my friend who got killed. You gotta have good recon of the area. And you gotta have room to spare. You know, take some shells out. If you're gonna land on a no-go-around strip, hell, I'll land my Cub on a 1,000-foot no-go-around strip. I'll land on an 800-foot go-around strip. Get down to 600 feet, I'm gonna think long and hard about that. I gotta have everything else has gotta be perfect. Suppose the wind's gusty. Well, you gotta have extra speed. But if you got extra speed, then you're gonna have to have a longer runway. So you gotta take a shell out, put in the shell for gusty wind, take the shell out with extra room. Well, now if you're heavy, maybe you can't do that. Maybe you can't balance them. And in gusty wind, you know, it's not the gust that kills you, it's the lull that stalls the wing. You can fly in the gust, but when it goes by, your airplane may quit. You know, I saw the video and the pictures of the fellow that landed on the top of the helipad in Dubai. And I think that's a very instructional operation. That helipad is 90 feet in diameter, but it's not at the top of the building. Unfortunately, it's part of the way down. So the airplane that he had was a Carbon Cub SS. Page flies a Carbon Cub SS. It's 950 pounds, and it's 180 horse. It's a hell of a hot rod Cub, and it will certainly land and stop in 90 feet if you have some wind. But they didn't stop there. They remade that airplane. They took 10% off of its weight, which if you go back to Sparky Impson's numbers, took 20% off of its landing rollout. They increased the horsepower from 180 horse to 230 horse by putting a nitrous oxide system in it. And they set it up so that the pilot could turn a switch which would activate it. And then if he firewalled it, he went from 180 to 230 horse like that. And that was so if his approach happened to be low, he could get up over and escape. Because all he had to do is be 2 feet low and it would wreck the airplane. They put a great big prop on it to handle that horsepower. They pulled up the wing tanks and replaced them with a tank behind in the passenger seat, because when you land and stop, the fuel wants to slosh to the forward part of those tanks, and that could put you on your nose. They put a crash pad under the tail, because on that particular landing strip, 6 or 8 feet out from the edge of it, there's a big steel rim. And unfortunately, that rim is higher than the landing spot. So you can't make a full stall 3-point landing. You gotta come in and make a wheel landing. And the problem is, if you catch the tail, it'll break it off. So they put a ramp from that rim down to the pad, so that at least if he got his main gear on that ramp, he could roll out. And they put that crash plate underneath the tail so that it wouldn't break if that's what happened. So what they were looking for was a 25% margin on the landing rollout. They figured out that they could make the approach speed at 33 miles per hour. Page's airplane stalls at 35. So they got from a 35-mile-an-hour stall speed down to a 33-mile-an-hour 2-point attitude. They needed a 7 to 15-mile-an-hour wind because they had to get the ground speed down to 20 miles an hour in order to preserve that safety margin. The pilot went on a diet and he practiced the landings hundreds of times. They spent 2 weeks up on that pad measuring and documenting the wind. They did smoke, they had smoke so that they could see what the wind was. What they figured out was that building was essentially an airfoil. And so the wind was turbulent around it. And every morning at sunrise, the wind would switch 180 degrees. And when it was safe to land on that was halfway between that switch. At the 90-degree point, the wind conditions on that pad were conducive to a landing. And they had between 10 and a half hour or something window in which to make that landing. With that particular spot, there's no peripheral vision to see when you come into land. You don't have like we do on runways. You just got this round pad to land on. So the pilot couldn't take his eyes off the touchdown spot. He couldn't look at the panel. So what they did is Mike Petit stood on the panel with a wind gauge and a laser gun. And he read out to the pilot in real time, continuously, what the wind speed was and what his ground speed was, to ensure that he had the exact approach angle and the exact touchdown speed that was going to let him put his wheels down and stop with 25% left over. So that's the kind of efforts that they made to change what looked like and was a very risky operation, an operation with a margin of safety. And that's what I think we have to have in every aspect of our aviation flying. We've got to build in a margin of safety because it is predictable that at some point we'll screw up. So we've got to evaluate our airplane. We've got to figure out what is the performance capabilities of our airplane. And it may not match the POH. Hell, my 180 has got wing extensions, it's got VGs. The POH is no longer valid. But you can figure out what it will do. I load, but you don't learn that flying the airplane empty. I loaded up to gross weight. I put hundreds of pounds of horse feed in it. First off, I look at the floats to see where the water line is. That tells me whether I'm at or over gross weight, because I know what it looks like when that happens. We had Paige and I spent a fair amount of time up at Puntilla Lake. We had a young pilot showed up there a few summers ago. Middle of the day, it was hot and windless. He had lunch, he had his wife and his child with him. And it came time to take off. They loaded up the family, taxied down there into the lake, and he started his takeoff run. He got down here about halfway down the lake, and he wasn't flying. He shut it down. He didn't try again. He taxied back to the shore, and we said, I need to take out some gas. How much? Just 5 gallons. So we got a 5-gallon can. He siphoned out 5 gallons of gas. He hopped in his airplane, he taxied back down to the other end of the lake, and he took off, and he went just fine. He knew his airplane. He figured it out. And he flew within its capabilities. He quit when it didn't work without any problem, and he came back and he made things right. I don't know if any of you ever remember Ray Tremblay. He was a chief pilot for the state of Alaska and ultimately was the pilot that managed the pipeline surveillance on the pipeline. One time, he and his buddy wanted to go hunting somewhere in interior Alaska, so they loaded up their airplane. They flew up to the Denali Strip at Mount McKinley, and they practiced their landings and takeoffs. They couldn't get the airplane off in the distance that they needed to get off in and have a margin for safety for the place that they were gonna go. They packed up their stuff and they came home. So, you know, I think we should, in every aspect of our flying, we should add that 25% margin, just like those guys did in Dubai. Frankly, for me, it's 50%. You know, Dan Hollingsworth has built a lot of Cubs, and he once said, you should never land a Cub on a runway shorter than 600 feet. And I make a very good living off of those who do. You know, Tom Wardley, who at least some of us will know, I think he was one of the beginners of this organization, and he was a friend of mine. He said, if you're down to only 3 options, you're getting into serious trouble. So let's go back to my friend who killed himself. He probably had 200 hours in that airplane that summer. It was a hot rod carbon Cub. It had a 190 horse engine. It had the heavy landing gear. It had 35-inch tires. And he had been flying, bush flying all over Alaska, hundreds of landings. Unfortunately, he had a habit of flying at the edge of the performance of that airplane and the edge of his flying skill. And this particular accident, you know, the details are not absolute, so, but the circumstance were, he took off that morning, his friend was flying, he was flying. This particular ridge was a difficult place to land. His friend went in and landed, pulled off out of the way and turned around. And the information is inconsistent, but at least one version is that he never made any recon passes to look at the landing spot. And I suspect that's what happened because he had profound confidence in his ability. But in any event, he circled, he came around, and he set up his approach to land, but he missed the landing line. He didn't land on the same line that his friend had landed on. So when he landed and started up there, he had it made. He could have just pulled the power and stopped. But he didn't know that because he hadn't looked it over. And so when he got to the place where he should have quit, he firewalled it, and that cost him his life. You know, I watched a hangar flying episode, a few weeks ago, and I wish I knew the guy's name, but what he said is if I'm going into a no-go around strip, at the final decision point, I commit to the proposition that the wreckage is going to be on that runway. I'm not going to change my mind after decision point for a no-go around. And, you know, and that makes a lot of sense because that accident is probably going to be at very low speed. And the probability is it's going to wreck the airplane, but we're going to survive. But if you do what my friend did, he got out of there, but he didn't have a manageable airplane. So, you know, we lost a pilot over in western Alaska this last summer, and we lost another one down in Iliamna, and I don't know the details of those accidents very much. But one thing that we can say for sure is that the aircraft and the environmental conditions were not compatible to staying in the air. And Newton and Bernoulli worked out the physics of those circumstances a long time ago, and they have not changed in hundreds of years. You've got to have a combination of flying skills and airspeed and so forth to put it together. Just keep in mind, like I said, my experience is we are not infallible. So add that up and add an additional margin to cover the circumstance in case you have failed or I have failed to evaluate the situation perfectly. I almost had one of those accidents last summer. It was a beautiful lake and a big cirque, high lake and a big cirque of mountains. And there was one way into the lake over a rocky shoreline, rocky bluffy shoreline. But there was a big enough lake, you could come in one way, you could circle around, and you could go back out the other way. So I did that exactly, flying my wife's airplane. I came in, and it was absolutely clear, glossy water. And I circled around, and I came around, and I looked at my departure point, and I'm 20 feet off the water, and everything's good, and I think, okay, I fly out, and I said to Paige, we can do this. So I came around again, I went back in toward the cliff, I turned around, I pointed to my escape route, set up for my glossy water landing. But I forgot that where the water meets the rocks and so forth, you can't see the shoreline. And the background, unfortunately, wasn't level. It was up and down and crooked and so on. I had no reference from which to evaluate whether my wings were level, and they were not. And I hit one float first, and I bounced, and I came down, and I survived it. But it was just an example of failing to anticipate that I couldn't see how to level my wings. So it's my hope that we'll all be back here next fall, and that your name won't be on my list, and that we can have a good summer of flying. Thank you very much.